Hi, Emily here from Homemade Emily Jane, and today I'm very excited to share with you some tips and tricks for strip piecing a quilt. If you are new to quilting or you've been quilting for a long time and never tried strip piecing, this tutorial will help you go into it with confidence. I'm going to share tips and tricks, I'm going to show you the process, and I'll answer some frequently asked questions as well. And finally, I also get to share with you about my newest quilt pattern. The doubled up quilt pattern, which you can learn more about right here, is a strip pieced quilt. So make sure you check that out if you want an example of a quilt pattern that uses this technique. For this tutorial, I am just going to demonstrate using some scraps of fabric that I have and cutting some strips and sewing them together and then making a quilt block with it. So you can follow along with this tutorial as well for just a fun little quilt block. Before we dive into the how to strip piece, let's talk about why. The benefits of strip piecing. First off, it can save so much time. It's way more efficient than cutting out a bunch of squares and sewing the squares together. It also can speed up both the cutting and the piecing process, as well as make your blocks a little bit more accurate and consistent once you nail down that 1/4 inch seam, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now let's talk about some supplies and tools you might need. Pretty much all of the standard quilting supplies, like a nice hot iron, some spray starch, sewing machine with a 1/4 inch foot, as well as sewing thread. I prefer cotton. If you want to learn more about thread, I do have a pretty extensive tutorial that can tell you all about different types of thread and when to use which types of thread. Also a rotary cutter and a cutting mat. I prefer using a nice long ruler for strip piecing. I have a 24-inch ruler that is so great. Or you can use a Stripology ruler, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. If you want to see a full tutorial about Stripology, check it out right here. You'll also need fabric, of course, as well as sewing pins and probably a pin cushion. If you want to see all my favorite quilting tools, supplies, rulers, everything all in one place, I do have an Amazon storefront where I list all my favorites. I'll put a link to that in the description below for you if you want to go ahead and browse through and maybe add some to your wish list. Are you ready to dive in and see strip piecing in action? Let's go ahead and get started. Before we're ready to cut our fabric, you'll want to prep your fabric, and that means getting out that spray starch or starch alternatives such as Best Press or Magic Spray, and get your iron nice and hot and press your fabric flat. I like to do a little mist of the spray and then iron it until it's dry. So that should make your fabric just a little bit more crisp and nice and flat, so it's easier to cut and easier to work with later on. If you already have a spray starch that's your favorite, go ahead and use that. The next step, and probably one of the most important steps, is cutting your fabric strips accurately and evenly. So let's go ahead and cover that, and I'll show it to you in action right here. So as you can see here, I've got my self-healing cutting mat, a rotary cutter, and a nice long quilting ruler. This one is by Creative Grids. And I have all my fabrics ready to go. So these are already pressed with some Best Press. One tip I want to share with you is to stay on grain with your fabric. So you'll see here, if you see lots of fraying happening at the edge, that means your fabric is not on grain. So on grain would be like a completely straight fabric with like one thread completely straight. Complete perfection can be hard to achieve, but just getting close is really important. So what you can do is line it up with the selvage or with a fold. If you don't have a nice long ruler like this, you can fold your fabric and then line up with the fold. So that's another option too. So I have a nice long ruler. I'm going to use it and I'll show you how to do it. You line it up and you try to get it as straight on grain as possible. Hold down the ruler with one hand and cut with the other. So now once we have our grain, our straight edge, we can throw this little scrap away and we can rotate our fabric or rotate your cutting mat if you have that option. And well, you're gonna cut 2.5 inch strips for this little tutorial. So this is just gonna make a fun little strip pieced block for you. 2.5 inch strips are super popular in quilting, so that's why I chose that. So you can see on the ruler 2.5. I'm gonna line that line up and cut it nice and straight, pushing down with this hand so the ruler doesn't slip. And then I'll save this scrap for later. I'm going to repeat that process for all of my fabrics. I'm not using my Stripology ruler at the moment, but I will demonstrate that a little bit later in the video for you. I'll show you what it might look like to cut two fabrics at one time. You can see these are both off grain quite a bit. So I'm gonna just lay them on top of each other, being mindful that this lime green is not as far out as this one, so I can see where they both end. I'm going to line them up again. Make sure you line up really well the first time if you are cutting multiple fabrics at one time. And I'll cut off all of this excess here to get them nice and straight. And then just like if you were cutting just one, you just cut 2 layers at one time. Now, if you like the process of cutting multiple fabrics at a time, like I do, I do recommend it. Just don't cut more than like 4 at a time. Otherwise, it can be kind of messy and just get a little cumbersome and difficult. One additional tip for accurate cutting is to use the same ruler throughout your project. Changing your ruler can increase the likelihood of just a slight little bit being off or different, and we want to keep consistency throughout our strip piecing. So now I ended up cutting 6 strips. I repeated this fabric twice, and I'm going to bring these over to my sewing machine and sew them together into sets of 2. So I'll bring this over and show you some tips for accurately piecing that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm at my sewing machine with a 1/4 inch foot on my presser foot and cotton thread in both the top and the bobbin, and just a standard sewing machine needle. I think it's probably a 75 or an 80. And I am going to sew these strips together. So I'm going to start off on the selvage side for this strip and put them right sides together. Someone recommended to me that you're supposed to sew from one direction on one strip set and then the other direction on the next. So we're going to try that. I personally haven't noticed a huge difference, but if it's a best practice, let's do it. So I'm going to put these right sides together and begin sewing using that 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you feel more comfortable pinning your pieces together, you can, or you can just line up this edge and guide it through, just gently holding it so that you're not like pulling it tight. Let it feed through the machine. Anytime you see the strips start to get a little bit off, go ahead and shift them back so that they are perfectly lined up. So as I mentioned, we started at the selvage side for those. So I'm going to line these up, but I'm going to sew them together starting from the other side. I'm going to line up the selvages as best as I can, but we're going to sew in this direction. And then this next step, again, right sides together, and also starting at the selvage side. If you're sewing a very long strip, like if it's the full width of fabric, or even this is kind of long too, you can sew like a couple inches and then readjust to get them lined up. So I sewed to there, and then I'm going to come down to the edge and make sure that the rest is lined up. I forgot to share one very important tip that I always forget to do. So learn from my mistakes here. When you are sewing for strip piecing purposes, you're going to want to change the stitch length on your machine. So my sewing machine defaults to a 2.5 stitch length when I turn it on. So I always, for strip piecing, need to remember to go down, and I do a 2.0 stitch length for strip piecing. That is because there's no reinforcing of seams and there's no back stitching. So if you wanted to even do a 1.5, that's fine too. I prefer 2. So if your machine has a knob that you can change the stitch length that way, just a slightly smaller stitch length keeps these stitches from unraveling once you've cut your strips into segments. The next step in our strip piecing project will be to press these seams. I always start by setting the seam. So I've lined up all 3, and I just take that hot iron over to basically just iron the seam that you just sewed. It helps it lay a little bit more flat. So we're going to press to the side like this. If you're following a quilt pattern, it will tell you which way to press, and that thought process has been thoroughly thought out. I've also read that with strip piecing, you can press the seams open to make them lay a little bit flatter. I personally disagree with that for strip piecing specifically because I feel like it weakens the seams. So I love pressing seams open for flatness, but for strip piecing specifically, I kind of stray away from it. And you'll notice I finger press first with my hand, and then I come behind with the iron so that I can make sure to get it as flat as possible. Next, I'm going to follow that same step, except this time with the correct stitch length, and I'm going to sew all of these units together so that we've got one panel that has 6 strips in it. One more tip I can share with you: once you're sewing your strip sets together, use your finger, if you're pressing to the side, to line up these seams. So they actually nest right here in the center. So I can kind of feel if they're nesting correctly, if they're coming together, meeting in the right place, as well as lining up here. So having those 2 points of lining up really helps with keeping them consistent. So now we have our 6 strip panel. So I was able to line up the selvages roughly, and you'll see that this end is kind of messy. They're not all the same length, and that's okay. I did decide to press them all in the same direction. So you'll see all the seams are going one way. And I know I promised you earlier I would show you how to use the Stripology ruler. So I'm going to grab that now, but you can use a normal ruler for this step as well. So I place the Stripology ruler, and I use these horizontal lines to line up as many places as possible. Let me see. So I'm using these white lines, and I'm making sure that the piece that I'm cutting is within the teardrops. So like from here to here. I make sure that the selvage is well beyond where this 0 line is. And I'm going to begin cutting into 2.5-inch strips. So just like I did 2.5-inch strips the first time, that's what we're doing here as well. You can do a different size strip if you want to though. So I do 0, and that cuts off the selvage and gives us a really nice straight point to start with. And then the Stripology ruler has these little squares for every 2.5 inches. So that's really handy to look at without having to do math. So once you've cut out your strips, I cut out 6 of them. You can cut out as many as you need for your pattern. You can separate them like this. And for this block that we're making, I'm going to rotate every other piece. Just like this. So our block is going to look something like this. Next up, you'll want to grab your sewing pins. I have this really neat like slap bracelet, with my pins on it as a pin cushion. Obviously you can use whatever pins you have, but we are going to pin these together into sets of 2. So paying attention to where the middle is of each set, because we don't want to get it wonky. I'll line them up and I'll do right sides together, of course, and you'll see we are nesting our seams. So one more reason not to press the seams open. And I like to pin pointing towards the seam that I'm going to sew, and I make sure that that pin is out of the way of the 1/4 inch seam allowance. I try to take the pins out as I sew. However, it's nice to know, like, if you're pinning this way, that you're not going to accidentally sew over a pin. So I'm going to pin at every intersection where 2 seams are going to meet up. This pinning step is going to make it so that your points are absolutely perfect. So we did that one, and then we'll do that 2 more times. Once your seams are all pinned, we can go ahead and bring these to the sewing machine and stitch them together. Now I do have my stitch length set to 2.0. You don't necessarily have to do that for this step. I just like to try to be consistent as much as possible. So do your stitch length whatever you feel comfortable with, but doing a little bit smaller than usual won't hurt. And now we're just stitching that same 1/4 inch seam, making sure as we go over each seam that the seam is nested and that we're not accidentally tucking any of the fabrics on the back side. Now you can take the pins out as you go, or you can wait until you're done with your entire piece and take them all out at one time. And then just repeat that for the other pieces of your block. And now we are back to pressing. So I'll go ahead and set the seams, and then we can press these either open or to one side. For this project, it doesn't matter. You'll want to follow whatever your pattern says if you're following a pattern for a specific strip piecing design. So I'm just going to press it to the side because it's a little quicker. I do love pressing open because they'll lay a little bit more flat. But I also love nesting seams, so figure out what you like and go with that. So we should end up with 3 identical strip pieced units that we will end up sewing together into one quilt block. Now we'll repeat the same steps with pinning, same process, pinning and sewing, just get these all into one block. I hope you enjoyed using this little tutorial to make this strip pieced quilt block with me. Of course, there are so many wonderful ways to use strip piecing for quilting, and I wanted to share with you, this is my doubled up quilt pattern. It is a beginner friendly, easy strip pieced patchwork quilt pattern that I know you'll love. I would be so honored if you purchased it from my shop, and I'll put a link for that down below, or you can watch this video to learn more about the pattern. Now let me cover some frequently asked questions as well, just in case you have any questions about strip piecing. Let's go ahead and get them out of the way. A lot of people ask what size strips to cut, and honestly it depends on the pattern and the style and the design that you're going for. So you could cut strips of all different sizes. I made this little mini quilt. This turned into a zipper pouch, but obviously these were strip pieced using very, very small strips. Or you could use larger strips like 5 inches, even 10 inches, depending on how big of a design you're going for. So really, the answer to that question is it just depends. If you wanted to follow along with this pattern, I use 2.5 inch strips because that's a very common measurement for quilting, but you could use bigger or smaller. Another question I get often is, what is a scant 1/4 inch seam? And a scant 1/4 inch seam is basically just a hair smaller than a 1/4 inch to allow for fabric to fold over the thread. Is it important? Yes, of course, obviously, it's very important. As you learn to quilt and as you practice quilting, you'll get better and better at it. The key with strip piecing is to be consistent. So use the same presser foot, same sewing machine, same ruler, everything, and it should work out just fine for you. If you want more tips on your scant 1/4 inch seam and how to test it to make sure that it's accurate, check out this tutorial right here. Another question is how to avoid like waviness or bowed strip sets, and that is just cut as on grain as possible. Make sure that you're cutting straight and sewing straight as well and not doing any pulling as you're sewing. Finally, people ask all the time if you can use pre-cuts. Yes, of course you can use pre-cuts. A jelly roll or a roll of 2.5 inch strips is a really great place to start. Thank you so much for watching this video about strip piecing. I hope you learned something new and loved this video. If you did, make sure you drop a comment below. I'd love to hear what you learned or some feedback. If you have any questions that I didn't answer, I would love to hear them and answer them for you in the comments. As always, make sure you subscribe here on YouTube and find me over on Instagram at HomemadeEmilyJane, and check out HomemadeEmilyJane.com for so many more quilting tips, tricks, and tutorials. Happy sewing!